Hi, Dr. Sabatino, and welcome to the Truth About Weight Loss Summit. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh, I can't wait to hear your presentation. Dr. Sabatino, you've worked with so many people over the years. Why do you think it is so hard for people to lose weight and keep it off?
Yeah, that's a very important question, and that's what I want to really address through the context of this information today and posing it out to our listeners, our watchers. Have you ever had the experience of successfully taking weight off and having a difficult time keeping it off? Have you ever been on a dietary plan that you seem to be great guns when you start, and then you kind of lose the mojo, and before you know it, you're kind of back on those things where the choices now are controlling you and you're no longer controlling those choices? Well, you're in a big club. The bottom line is right now, we have close to 70% of this American population either overweight or obese. We have a dieting industry that is a $70 billion industry with a 95% failure rate. So we know that this is a very difficult task for people in terms of even making change. And we're going to focus on food today, but we're going to also get into some of the reasons and ways that we can create strategies to help us create that margin of success. And it really begins with understanding that you are really kind of perfect the way you are. And unfortunately, we live in a culture where there's so many ways that we have models for how people think we're supposed to look and the weight we're supposed to achieve. And it's no question, being overweight and being overfat is one of the major risk factors for the most major disabling diseases on this planet, whether that be heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes. These are all kind of weight-related issues. And I know we're at a time now where they're trying to help people and want people to feel good about themselves. So, we're not about body shaming. We're not into doing any of that. But it is important that as we set goals, that they become legitimate goals. They come from a standpoint of self-worth and strength, and understanding that the weight is a risk factor. So we don't want to celebrate it. We want to address it, but we also want to reinforce the idea of your own self-worth and self-esteem. And we're going to spend time going through that, because as we have gotten fatter and overweight, and as the culture right now, 15% of the planet is overweight, there's this obsession, as you can see on this slide, with thinness. And that thinness model is something that has been imposed on the culture from the entertainment industry, from the fashion industries. So for many people, including very young people, the end of thinness justifies any means of getting there. I saw a show not long ago on national television about these girls under the age of 6 already involved with bulimic and vomiting behavior. I'm not a psychologist, but if you sat in my office through the years, doctors, lawyers, and Indian chiefs, I have surgeons in between surgical procedures vomiting their brains out in the back rooms. I have judges in between cases in their private quarters vomiting their brains out. So this obsession, and again, there's now become this really epidemic of vomiting, bulimic, and purging behavior in men, because facetiously, men have decided, why should women have all the fun? And it's not fun at all. But it's interesting that as we are getting heavier and heavier, as we are increasing this risk, we see this obsession of thinness, but it comes from a place of what I like to call very unrealistic goals. Meaning it's coming from a place of, a model for how we are supposed to look based on the fashion industry and so on. And we're seeing some of this trauma now, even in Instagram, with young girls and young people who are really trying to achieve these goals. And when they don't quite make it, there's such a self-deprecation that it can actually lead to harm, suicide, and other kinds of problems. So it's a very interesting piece. And I think while we want to have a goal, while you want to have a goal for how the weight that you may want to have, the health that you may want to achieve, I think it's important to put it in the context of a realistic goal, really honoring yourself, seeing the worth of yourself while you establish those goals. I mean, frankly, no matter what I do, I'm probably not going to end up looking like Brad Pitt. And if you're a woman, you're probably not going to end up looking like Angelina Jolie. But I kind of like the line that Cindy Crawford, the supermodel, said. She said, when I get up in the morning, I don't even look like Cindy Crawford. And the truth of the matter is, if you could walk around airbrushed all day and modified all day, you would look more like those kinds of things. And that's one of the reasons right now, one of the biggest addictions, in my opinion, is cosmetic surgery. Every line, every wrinkle, everything that is kind of part of our journey, our path in life, we need to somehow obliterate that, smooth it out. There can't be any evidence of our aging and experience. And I think it's really been so counterproductive to the health and well-being of people. So this obsession within this, establishing more realistic goals. Now, within the context of that, there is still major discrimination in job interviews and college interviews for people with weight issues. So the person with a weight issue is really looking to buy hope wherever they can find it. So here you are in the supermarket, and as you approach the cashier, as you well know, over each shoulder are those racks of scientific journals, the Enquirer, the Star, the New Observer, and on the cover is Dr. Sabatino's 21-day miracle diet, stay thin forever. And of course, next to it is a picture of Oprah or Roseanne or some alien from Mars that's lost 20 pounds on this diet. And what they fail to tell you, that in the next few months, they put back 40 of those 20 pounds. Because you'll see that as you go into that, it leads usually people to extreme forms of deprivation. And when you look at how many people are eating with most of the processed foods, the junk foods, the animal products, it actually is establishing hormonal environment that even makes it difficult for you to be successful, for you to be well. And we're not addressing that. So you're just looking for that quick fix. And you've got these high protein diets and you've got these keto diets, and all of these quick fix approaches create their own devastation over time. And they cause typically reactive weight gain. So when you go into these quick fix approaches, there's going to be a period of deprivation that you associate with being success. But of course, when you're depriving yourself of food, there's going to be a basic hunger. There's a craving. And because of the underlying hormonal things, for example, when you're eating high fat and animal products, you're going to generate insulin resistance. When insulin's not working well, sugar can't get into your cells as effectively. So sugar levels will begin to rise in your bloodstream while your cells are starved for sugar. And when your cells are starved for sugar, guess what you're going to crave? Anything sweet and garbagey that you can find at hand. So that deprivation only leads to craving, which you wind up then doing, filled with all the guilt that is associated with doing that. And where do you do it? You're doing it down the block, in the alleyway, underneath the covers, in the closet of your home. I mean, I've seen all of this behavior for so many years in counseling people that I really know and have come to love over time. So this tape of people looking for hope with quick fixes, and then the deprivation, craving, guilt, and failure cycle, which leads to rounds of failure, is the most common tape that plays in the heads of most people dieting today. And it's one of the reasons why the weight loss industry is a $70 billion industry with a 95% failure rate. So what I really want to do going through today is I really want to provide a different tape. I want to counter that deprivation, craving, guilt, and failure process. And I'm going to replace it with something that we'll call awareness, responsibility, and self-esteem. And we're going to come back into how we establish that tape. But to understand that, we've got to understand a couple of things that are underneath all of this. And what I want to share with you is a model that's going to play very importantly for how we establish compulsive behaviors and addictions. And I think you'll see as we do this, it'll lead us into a way to create that tape that we want to replace in our heads. And just for the sake of simplicity, just understand that in the nervous system, your brain and nervous system are constantly communicating, putting chemicals, creating the release of chemicals that are very much involved with the ongoing communication in our brain and nervous system. Everything you experience, everything you interpret, everything that you perceive is a byproduct of how this nervous system is communicating within itself. And we have billions of nerve cells in the nervous system. And you'll notice on the left, you have something that kind of looks like the end of a baton, and there's a red arrow in it. When that nerve, this is the end of a nerve, when that nerve is stimulated electrically, that's what that red arrow is on the left, it triggers a movement. You'll see number 2 on your slide of calcium entering that nerve. Calcium, and the end of those nerves, you'll see little vesicles with little red dots in them. Those nerve cells are producing all of the chemicals of communication in the brain and nervous system, and they're stored in those little vesicles at the end of nerves. When that nerve becomes electrically stimulated, you'll notice that the end of the nerve opens up and drops off those little dots in the space between the end of that nerve and the green on the right side of that slide. And you'll notice that in that other nerve, you'll notice these things that look like blue X's and bars. Those are protein receptors. So when those neurotransmitters, those little dots, are released in that space, and that space is called a synapse, those little chemicals travel across that space. They attach to those blue proteins, those receptors. They trigger a chemical event, which triggers another electrical event, and that will go on to the tune of billions and billions of nerve cells every second of every day. And when that happens, you'll hear your neighbor, or you'll experience joy, or you may experience whatever you experience. You may have a communication. All of that is a byproduct of the simple production of these chemicals, the release into that space, and then the actual connection where you're getting the release, you're getting an attachment on those blue receptors. Now, the body wants to be able to regulate that communication, and the body is wise. It's wise beyond anything that you and I can really even talk about. The wisdom is so profound. When we release a chemical, if that chemical is going to be involved in exciting us or relaxing us or making us feel good, the body wants to have a way that it can kind of modify that communication. It's not just boom, boom, boom. It has a way to smooth that out. So when you release those transmitters from the end of that nerve into that space, there's a couple of things that can happen. The body has enzymes that can break it down. It has enzymes that can take it back up from where it was absorbed, released to begin with. And then you have information that will feed back. That other nerve on the other end of that will feed back to your brain and letting your brain know that enough of this chemical has been released. So for example, if I release a chemical that makes me feel good, and we're going to talk about one of the transmitters called serotonin. Serotonin is involved with a certain sense of well-being, okay? A certain sense of sleep, helping us sleep better, well-being. If that chemical was not released enough, we may not feel that good. That's why in cases of depression, there's this idea that maybe one of these transmitters is not operating as well. So one of the things that doctors do is for people with depression is they will give them pharmaceuticals, they'll give them drugs that will block the reuptake of that chemical from that space so that it lingers longer, helping you feel better longer. The problem is that when you do that, the brain begins to believe that it's releasing enough of that when it's really the drug that's making that happen, and it will stop its own production. So understand that there's always a communication. When you produce any chemical in the body, as that chemical is produced, that information will feed back and tell your brain that enough is being made. We don't need to make any more. So a lot of the problems with many of the drugs that are used to treat anxiety and depression is they give you the information that the brain is making enough of these chemicals that help you feel less anxious and less depressed, when in fact it's the drug that's making them linger longer. So if I abruptly stop that drug, your body is not producing enough of that. And that's why sometimes with children, teenagers, if you abruptly stop antidepressants, they can actually commit suicide. They can get so depressed, they can get so down. So the bottom line here is understand that not only can we release chemicals, but we can modify the communication by how we remove it from the space, take it back up, or even produce enzymes and proteins that can literally break it down. But this dance is going on every second of every day to the tune of billions and billions of nerve cells in this beautiful ongoing communication in the nervous system. So all I really want you to understand is that there's a process for how that nervous system communicates, and it's fundamental to how we feel about the world, how we perceive the world, how we interpret the world. Now, we also know that in that brain, there is something that is what we call the brain reward cascade. We literally have the built-in ability, all of us, to experience pleasure from the simple acts and joys of life. If I asked you right now, why do you do what you do? Why are you making the choices that you do? You may say to me, well, I was exposed to those choices as a child in my family. Maybe my parents exposed me to those, so I make that choice. Or perhaps I met somebody influential in my life and they influenced me in some way, and I want to create those kinds of choices and options, or through my own experience. But I'm going to contend to you that the reason why you're making the choices that you do routinely is because on a very fundamental level, you have associated them with pleasure, reward, and survival, no matter what. And so we have that built-in ability in our brain to experience pleasure from the simple acts and joys of life. The hug of a mate, the kiss, a meditation, a walk in the park. And that has become known in this field of addiction and compulsive behavior as the brain reward cascade, the path to pleasure. As it turns out, that path is literally a waterfall of chemistry, and I love that word cascade, that begins with this release of the neurotransmitter called serotonin in one part of the middle of your brain. Imagine sticking a poker between your eyes and right down the center of your skull. Those two pokers would meet in the middle of your brain where this reward area is, this reward cascade. In science, they call it the limbic system. You don't need to get lost in the name, just know it's the path to pleasure in our brain. So serotonin is released, then one of the opiates is released that helps to modify, there's an enzyme that modifies that chemical so it can smooth that communication. Then there's the release of another transmitter that helps to kind of regulate and smooth out this cascade, this waterfall. A peptide called neuropeptide Y, which you're going to see is the most dominant neuropeptide, small little protein fragment in all mammal brains, and it's directly involved with eating behavior, which is kind of very intriguing for our talk today. And then finally, the endpoint of this cascade, the endpoint of this pathway, if you see the little box in the waterfall, is the reward area. You'll see where it says reward, and that is our good friend dopamine. So all these steps of this brain reward cascade are leading to the outcome of dopamine associated with our path to pleasure. And the ability of dopamine to attach to receptors in your brain, the ability of dopamine to fire effectively, the ability of these other transmitters to modify how dopamine is released is critical to our ability to feel good about ourselves, to feel good about the world, to feel good with the behaviors and choices that we make. Now, as it turns out, I think you can appreciate that this is going to be tied into two very special things that in evolution were important for our survival. Obviously, one is food and the other is sex. Without food, we can't nurture ourselves. Without sex, we can't reproduce. So the ability to experience pleasure in that behavior, procuring food and eating and having sex, is critical to our survival. So guess what? Not only does the body have a pathway that we call the brain reward cascade, that waterfall of chemistry tied into feeling good, and that's what the reward is, but the body wants to make sure that when you experience that pleasure and reward, that you can remember it. So there's other parts of the brain that are pathways, they're interactive circuits in the brain that help you remember that experience so you can repeat it in the future. There's other pathways that actually drive your motivation to go get it. And finally, you have other parts of the brain that will kind of be like an organizational manager overlooking over all those circuits to kind of exert some level of control. So we have this inborn ability to create pleasure. We call it the brain reward cascade. There are other pathways of dopamine in our brain that not only give us reward, but help us remember the pleasure, drive our motivation to do it again, and then control the overall dance and picture of what's happening in that communication. Now, when we talk about neurotransmitters, I'm going to lay something out to you, because when I talk about a helpful program later, we're going to talk about even some degree of a little bit of supplementation that actually can help this story. And I want to share it with you now. All of those neurotransmitters, those key players in the brain related to pleasure, serotonin, the opiates, GABA, dopamine. You don't need to get lost in it, but just know that there's a cast of players. As it turns out, all of the neurotransmitters in the brain are actually made from amino acids, the building blocks of protein, and certain minerals and vitamins. So, for example, we know that if you look at L-tryptophan, which is an amino acid, it's involved in producing serotonin. Serotonin helps with mood elevation, social behavior, and even our sleep phase. People that have difficulty sleeping, a lot of times there's a suppression of serotonin, and serotonin plays a major role for bowel function and health. And just as an aside, know that probably 95% of all the serotonin in your body is produced by the bacteria in your gut. The healthy microbiota, the trillions of organisms that we have naturally in our bodies help produce this. When there is a deficiency of serotonin, here's what happens. We see some depression, we see anxiety, we see insomnia, we can see suicidal thoughts. So you can see how important it is for the body to produce this. When we look at L-glutamine or GABA, GABA aminobutyric acid is the major transmitter that's involved with reducing anxiety. It actually inhibits dopamine release. Now, why would it want to do that? We made the point that dopamine is involved with pleasure and reward and feeling good. Well, think if you had a remarkable excess of dopamine, you probably run around picking flowers all day and not get anything else done. So the body has to kind of regulate that, control that, and smooth it out. So the interaction of these different neurotransmitters in your brain creates beneficial outcome. So GABA will actually inhibit dopamine release, and it regulates mood and anxiety. Many of the drugs that people take for anxiety are a class of drugs called benzodiazepines. These are drugs like Xanax and Klonopin and Valium. Those drugs are attempting to raise this GABA level in the brain. That's not the best way to do it, because when you do that with those drugs, it gives the brain the signal as if it is making enough of this when it's not. And that's why when you try to come off of those drugs, they're so habit forming and addictive, it can take years for people to regulate those. If you have a deficiency of GABA, there's anxiety, there's insomnia, there can be hyperactivity, and stress, really involves stress. So look at the amino acid, L-glutamine. It helps to make the neurotransmitter that's regulating mood and anxiety. L-tyrosine and D-L-phenylalanine are two amino acids that are involved in producing dopamine. So that dopamine is going to be involved in brain reward, which we said, muscle control, arousal, sex, and orgasm. All of that is tied into the release of dopamine. And obviously, those are beautiful things. And if dopamine is deficient, there's what we call reward deficiency, or Parkinson's, or Tourette's. So you can see how important these neurotransmitters are for this kind of function. And then there's L-tyrosine with neuropeptide Y, and that's involved with eating behavior, mood stability, fear, and our stress responses. It plays a major role in modifying that reward pathway. And we know that when it's deficient, we have eating disorders, compulsive overeating, compulsive undereating, anorexia, bulimia, PTSD, depression. So if you look at this slide, you'll notice that the key players in the brain, like serotonin and GABA and dopamine, are actually being produced by amino acids. And I'm going to come back to that, because you're going to see that in compulsive behavior and in addiction, there can be a modification of that brain reward, which is where we're going to go next. Because if you look at this brain reward, we now know that there are a number of lifestyle factors, and they include things like genetics, chronic stress, poor nutrition, trauma, physical, emotional, sexual, sleep deprivation, that can literally modify that cascade of chemicals that give you that feeling of pleasure. And they may not be expressed as well. It can actually create a deficiency of your brain reward cascade, your pleasure pathway. And when you have that, you have what now is called the fundamental foundation, if you will, in all addiction, and it's called the reward deficiency syndrome. As you modify those chemicals that give you pleasure, there can be feelings of alienation, emptiness, isolation, self-centeredness. And if it goes on long enough, there can be anxiety, depression, and craving. And that's not only for food, that's just craving for emotional support, for emotional balance, for well-being on a physical, emotional, and even spiritual level. And that leads to what we call the loss of pleasure and reward. Now, understand this, we have a natural inclination, a natural drive for pleasure. When we lose the ability to experience pleasure from the simple acts and joys of life because of this reward deficiency syndrome, no brain wants to feel that. Nobody wants to feel isolated and anxious and depressed and empty. So what we then will do is we will tend to self-medicate with the 5 major forms of addiction. And those basically are drugs and alcohol, food, sex, gambling, which used to be called risk-taking, and then things like process addictions, like work, internet, porn, many things, that shopping, things that people get involved in as process addictions. Understand this, though, it's kind of intriguing because even whether it's a substance that you're taking or whether it's a behavior like work addiction, they both tend to trigger that brain reward cascade. So in this place of reward deficiency, when you're feeling isolated and anxious and depressed, you start looking for some way to medicate your own deficiency, your own reward deficiency with these 5 major forms of addiction. Now, to understand that even further, we need to have a simple definition that we can agree with while we go through this. And in the field of addiction, this is what has been used in a very simple way to describe people with use disorders of various kinds. It is the continued or compulsive use of a mood-altering substance or behavior, and here's the very important point, without regard for negative consequences. So one of the hallmark psychological features of addiction is that there is the idea of denial. You are denying that it is a problem. Look, if I drink a glass of wine, I'm going to call that substance abuse. It may not be addiction, but if I'm drinking to the point where now I'm putting my entire community in jeopardy because I'm driving drunk, or I'm doing something to hurt my family, gambling our money away, there's a major negative consequence. So in the field of addiction, they've separated the idea of use, abuse, and addiction. And addiction relies and requires this denial. Look, you're looking in the mirror, you see yourself getting bigger and bigger, heavier and heavier, fatter and fatter, and you find yourself eating the same junk food that's pushed you into being 200, 300, 400 pounds, and you're just in total denial of those negative consequences. That would be an addiction problem. So I want you to understand that not everybody has addiction, but that's how we define it. And there's a huge health and social impact. If you look, in the United States, there's about 330 million people. About 3.5 million people die every year. You'll notice heart disease is almost 700,000, cancer about 600,000, and you see the numbers for stroke, diabetes, and obesity. But I want you to notice something. Addiction, we're talking about 1 in 5 people in the population. That's 66 million people. And understand that 50 to 85% of all rapes, murders, robberies, spousal abuses, and weapons violations are all with people that are under the influence of some substance use disorder. So this is very important. And if you look at the numbers, we got about 23 million people with drugs and alcohol, tobacco. We got about 60 million people using tobacco products. 80 to 90% of the population is using caffeine. We have 20% of all of this addiction related to food addiction, sex, gambling. And interestingly enough, 17%, almost 20% of all attempted suicides are for gambling addicts. So you can see this huge health and social impact. So what that leads to is that when you consider the heart, the lung, the kidney, the liver, brain damage, cancer, stroke, obesity, diabetes caused by the destructive and compulsive consumption of alcohol, tobacco, other drugs, meat, dairy, salt, sugar, processed oils, junk food, addiction is arguably the most significant pandemic of disability, disease, and death. It's not heart disease, because heart disease will come under that heading of using these substances. So I want you to understand that when we talk about this, this has a huge health and social impact. And a big part of this centers around the use of food, because it's really one of those things that's going to nurture us. Now, just very briefly, there are going to be 4 stages to how we look at addiction. Number one, most people experiment to begin with. And this may even be with foods, but it certainly has to do with other drugs and alcohol and things of this nature. And you're trying it out. It may be very young, very early stage in your life. And then there's a social use. You're using it with people, you use it to relax, to fit in. And of course, this can play a big role even with food. And then what happens, though, is that as you use it more routinely, you find that it takes a lot more of the same stuff to get you off. It's what in the field of addiction they call chasing the first high. And you're not quite getting that same buzz the same way, because you need so much more now. And then eventually it loses its impact. And now you're no longer using whatever it is for major pleasure. You're just using it to quiet the pain of living day to day, just to get out of bed in the morning. And at that point, what's happened is you've moved from kind of a social use and experimentation into a place where the primitive part of your brain, the very reactive part of your brain that's involved with protecting you against trauma in a very reactive way in the environment, now takes over. So in a way, it begins to hijack the brain. So the primitive reactive part of your brain overtakes the control part and is actually giving your brain the signal that without this food, without this substance, without this behavior, you cannot survive. And when you're in the throes, that's when you are in the true throes of dependency. And it centers around that denial and constant use. I have a friend that's that's a diabetic, and she's into even watching this happen, watching her sugar escalate. She's into eating about 12 to 15 Dove bars a day. And she'll go to a clinic, she'll do it for a while, she'll stop, and then she'll go back to it. We are driven because that part of the brain is hijacking the control portion, the intellectual portion. And so this is a very real issue. And it's also why in the field of addiction, the pathway from simple abuse to addiction, they liken it to what people call the life of a cucumber. And that is, once you become a pickle, never a cucumber again. It's like that idea, someone says, well, I can control my use. If you could have, you would have. And that's usually what doesn't happen. And so the bottom line here is, if you've got a major issue with alcohol, let's say, for the sake of argument, the bottom line is when you get sober, you can't have a little alcohol. You don't go up to a heroin addict and say, you know what, I'd like you to shoot a $2 bag or a $3 bag rather than a $5 bag. Yeah, it's less of that substance, but it only reinstates the entire process. So that's why people tend to promote abstinence from some of these issues more than other things, because they find sometimes that pathway is a little bit easier for people to be abstinent. But all I want you to get here is that to understand that there's an underlying ability that we have to experience pleasure. When that is compromised by lifestyle factors that even include genetics and other forms of stress and abuse, we can create a compromise of those chemicals of pleasure in the brain, leading to reward deficiency that makes us truly not feel good, feel isolated, craving, empty, anxious, depressed, and no brain wants to feel that. So then we seek out self-medication. And when we look at this constellation of factors, no matter what the addictive process is, whether it's food, whether it's drugs, whether it's alcohol, it always involves these 4 things. There's going to be a physical component where there's toxicity and damage to the body. There's actual damage. You're eating to the point where now you're diabetic. Blood sugar's going up. It's causing damage on blood vessel walls. It's causing damage to the brain. It's causing damage to the heart. So all of that physical damage is there. And if I abruptly take away these substances, it can create a certain degree of withdrawal. Remember, all withdrawal is that when you're taking a substance, let's suppose I'm taking heroin, you have receptors in your brain for opiates. So heroin occupies those receptors instead of your own natural opiates. And and when it occupies those spaces in your brain, the brain begins to believe it's making enough opiates, but you're taking it from the outside. So it stops producing its own. When I stop taking that heroin, if I just abruptly take it away, there's going to be a period of time between when my body starts recreating those chemicals again. And that space of time is what we call the withdrawal phase. It's a time where the body's trying to compensate for the overuse because of drug abuse or whatever, or behavioral abuse. Then the psychological component we already talked about, and that is denial and isolation. This is the fundamental psychological framework for all people with compulsive behavior and addiction. You deny the consequences and then you isolate, doing it alone, doing it under the covers, in the closet, down the block. The spiritual component of addiction and compulsive disorders is what we call a self-centeredness versus a worldview. On a simple level, without getting very religious, we can make the point that spirituality is about looking at things outside of ourselves, having concerns for things that are not just our concerns, concerns about the world, concerns about other species. And this is one of the reasons why I love a plant exclusive lifestyle, that the one that we recommend, because it is about compassion, it is about love, it is about empathy for things outside of us. But that spiritual component has to be addressed. And then there are genetic biochemical alterations that are part of the metabolic situation. Understand that we now know that one of the common genetic alterations that happens in addiction is that the receptor for dopamine becomes compromised. It's called the D2 receptor, so that dopamine can no longer attach effectively. So there is probably about 30 to 40% of true full-blown hardcore addicts that have that genetic complex. And for those people, there's no way that they can feel good, and that's why they're looking to self-medicate. But understand that genetic changes don't happen alone. Oftentimes they happen in bundles, or at least a couple of them happening at the same time. As it turns out, we now know that the body will process foods and chemicals differently when you have some of these genetic modifications, because the biochemical pathways of the body are being modified. Classic example. They were looking at one point at homeless alcoholics on the streets of, I believe it was Dallas. And when they were doing autopsies, what they discovered were high levels of morphine. Well, interestingly enough, these alcoholics did not have any exposure to morphine. But if you and I drink alcohol, there's an enzyme that the liver produces that helps us break this alcohol down to something called aldehyde, acid aldehyde, and then it's converted into carbon dioxide and water. And we will breathe it away or we will urinate it away. Okay, so there's a pathway that happens. Interestingly enough, the people with the genetic modification of the dopamine receptor have a situation, let's take alcohol, where they're no longer able to break alcohol down to that aldehyde and then water and carbon dioxide. It breaks it down to something that's THIQ, and you see that under the metabolic button on this slide. THIQ is a synthetic form of morphine. So those people with this genetic modification were literally converting alcohol into morphine. And that's why when these people took their first drink, that was the best they ever felt. It was the most social they ever felt. It was the most productive they ever felt. So what do you think they're going to say when you say, you know what, you need to stop drinking? Well, their first feeling is, I don't think so, because that's when I'm feeling at my best. So you can see the work that's involved in helping this situation. The bottom line is you have to understand there's going to be a physical component. You have to address the idea that, are you denying the consequence of what you're doing? Is there a spiritual component that can be helpful for breaking you out of your self-centeredness? This is one of the reasons why people in the field of addiction have even gone through and used 12-step programs. Because what do? They become a community where you're now breaking down the isolation. You're confronting people with the same problem, so you're kind of getting past the denial. So you're getting out of your self-centeredness by being involved in a community. So all of those approaches are trying to break down these constellation of factors. But the bottom line is, when we look at the support and care for this, it's very important to understand that when we talk about food addiction, it's unique. You know, you don't really have to shoot heroin, but you got to eat 2 to 3 times a day. So food, and so that means you got to confront that monkey meal in and meal out. And so the bottom line is, while we have this model that we talked about at the beginning, where people continually opt for these extreme forms of deprivation that only lead to craving and guilt and failure, the bottom line is, what we need to come back to is we've got to have some idea of awareness, what I'll call mindful awareness. And this means that when we're looking at food use, it's not only the content of what we're looking at that becomes important. Now, look, we know that, and we have a solution. You're going to hear about it on this summit. We know that when people are eating, again, low calorie dense food, high in fiber and water, high in nutrient density, that they're going to be satisfied, they're going to be full, they're going to be nurtured, and they're going to have weight regulation that's more advantageous. So the content of what you eat, of course, is incredibly important. But when it comes to the addictive process, and when we talk about mindful awareness, the context of your food use needs to be equally important. What are you using food for? Because many times we're eating for hunger that goes far beyond food need. We're really trying to satisfy things at a much deeper level. I grew up, I always talk about this, I grew up in an Italian household, and because for the first breath we took, you were taught to deal with stress with food. You know, you going through a divorce, eat some lasagna, you'll be okay. And actually, for a few minutes, you might be okay. But it's not really addressing the underlying trauma, the true context of what's going on for you. So when I say mindful awareness, I think that's a very important key step for taking a little bit more of a control over this process. But understand that when you're really in that compulsive place and you're really in an addictive place, your brain in many ways has been hijacked. That's why it's not just an issue of willpower, because otherwise everybody would stop. We're not talking about rocket science here. We're talking about very simple food choices. And we make them, but then we can't quite hold on to them sometimes. So we need to look at the context of what we are using food for. Look, that may be involved with even keeping a journal. That may be involved in being aware when you're eating mindlessly. I mean, think about it. Most people are eating so rapidly and mindlessly that they typically overeat before the brain can even be aware that they've begun to eat. So, you know, what's going on in your life? What is that like? What is that triggering in terms of your feelings? And, you know, on an emotional level, what is that making you feel? And can you step back? Can you delay your response enough to have some confrontation, some awareness of what that context is for you? And there are mindful eating practices that people do. And understand that this is really important, because when you look at people going into rehab programs, let's take a 30-day program, and many of you are aware of what these programs are about. The truth of the matter is, these programs are not really treatment programs. They're what we call stabilization programs. They stabilize use so that you can get on with the work of treatment on a physical, on an emotional, psychological, on a spiritual level. How do you break down that denial? How do you break down that self-centeredness, that isolation? But context becomes really, really important. And every person can be involved with better awareness of some of those factors. Now, tied into that is also what I like to call responsibility, because remember, I'm going to replace that guilt failure tape with the tape of awareness, responsibility, and self-esteem. Every person in this audience, me, you, all of us, we've taken responsible action in our lives. We've done it with our jobs, we've done it with our families, and frankly, we've done it with body image. But when it comes to body image, we can be incredibly hard on ourselves. And women, you have actually been brought up to be the most brutalized by that. I always use the example, you get a man in his 60s or 70s, he starts getting that belly that's sticking out, the waist is kind of falling over both sides of his belt, he gets that Milwaukee goiter, He's getting bald and gray and scruffy, and he looks in the mirror and he says, yeah, I don't look too bad. I'm only 5 pounds from studdom. You'll rarely find a woman at any size or weight. I've counseled international models going from 105 pounds to 95 that go through devastating hardship. And the truth of the matter is, you have got to continue to love yourself where you are. Even when you look in the mirror and you say, who the hell is that? Now, there is something that operates in the human body that we call set point. And I want to share and talk about it very briefly. Set point is kind of like a fat and calorie thermostat. It's kind of like the thermostat in your house for the AC unit. If you have very high calorie intake, if you've not been very physically active, that high level of intake becomes kind of your thermostat, your set point. Now you say, you know what, I want to lose weight, so I'm just going to starve myself. So you take away everything, and again, you'll lose a few pounds. Until when? Well, until you achieve that set point. Set point is kind of like a movie running inside your skull. Imagine that your brain is a screen and there's a movie running inside the skull, and you in your own head are the star of that movie. If your brain sees you as a fat movie star, it will do everything in its power to keep you fat. If it sees you as a thin movie star, it'll do everything in its power to keep you thin. So it's establishing a thermostat setting around calorie intake, physical activity, the amount of calories you're putting out in movement based on the amount of calories you're taking in. So the bottom line is, if you starve yourself and you push physical activity, all your body does is slow down your resting metabolism so you can hold on to those calories until you match that set point. And so that deprivation, dieting, really starving yourself approach, all it does is promote a little bit of a quick fix for a few pounds of weight loss until you eat again, at which point you will put that weight back on with a vengeance. Now understand something. The set point you have right now has been established over months and years by the choices you've made in what you've eaten, in how you've moved, in the stress that you've been under, your sleeping patterns, all of those factors. Can it change? Absolutely. It can absolutely change, but it will change based on your ability to be consistent over time. It will take a period of months and more sometimes to reestablish a new, well-established set point at a lower level where you become more calorie efficient, holding weight down and all of that. And it doesn't move in a straight line. It'll be a waveform. So there's going to be behavioral and physiological plateaus that'll be part of that. And you still need to hold your ground, knowing that you're moving forward. But there's going to be a time factor for the recovery of that set point. And it's going to happen whether you're cool with it or not. And if you're not cool with it, you're going to be one really frustrated mammal. But I have to tell you that while you're making that change, it is important, it is imperative that you never lose sight of your self-worth. You never lose sight of loving that person who you are. You are no different than that perfect baby that came into this world when you were first born. Just perfection. You may have layers of choices on top of that. You may have layers of trauma through your life layered on top of that. There can be many, many things that we've all experienced that are layered in terms of negative images and false beliefs about ourselves and destructive cellular memories. But the truth of the matter is, you are perfectly divine. You are, bottom line is, and I love this quote and we'll come back to this, by Baba Ram Dass, which you see here, that you are a being of beauty, of love, of awareness. And many of you may not know, Richard Alpert originally did the research with Timothy Leary way back in the day, and he wrote the book Be Here Now. But Baba Ram Dass is on his own spiritual path, but you are a being of beauty, of love, and awareness. And that becomes very important, because the fact of the matter is, it's hard to move forward from a place of self-hatred. It's hard to move forward from a place of anger. And I understand that in our culture, because of these ideals of body image and aging, that we are, in a sense, goaded to feel less than ideal within ourselves. We're really goaded to see ourselves in a more limited way. when that fundamental spiritual perfection has not changed, but we can have goals for how we want to shift our weight and how we want to improve our health. And all of that is fantastic, but it's got to come from a place of self-worth. It's got to come from a place of self-love. And that also builds into something that I like to refer to as self-esteem and self-forgiveness. And of course, self-esteem has a lot to do with really how we achieve and maintain the choices that we want to bring into our lives, the things that we accomplish. Of course, in the West, a lot of our self-esteem is based on acquiring degrees and acquiring money and acquiring possessions, because the mentality is that we're not good enough without all of that. The truth is we are. But self-esteem is also built by how we keep commitments with ourselves in this world. You know, if my car breaks down and I have to get to work at 9 o'clock in the morning, and Chef AJ says, you know what, look, I know I can give you a lift. I'll be in front of your house at 8:45. Be ready. 8:45 comes, she doesn't show. I take a cab, I get to work, maybe I bitch her out. And she says, I'm so sorry, something came up. Tomorrow I'll be there for you. And tomorrow she does the same thing. I come to the point where I don't feel like I can trust her. I don't want to put my faith in her. I don't believe she's going to be there. We do this with ourselves all the time. Today's the day you're going to start your diet. So you get the prepackaged bird seed out of the closet, you put it in your dish, you flit off to work. And here it is now, 10:30 in the morning, here comes that roller with the coffee and donuts. And you know, in your mind, you're saying, you know what, I want coffee and a donut. And so you have coffee and a donut, but then the next thought process is, well, I blew it today. Let me have the cheesecake for lunch, the other crap at night, when you could have said, wow, I had coffee and a donut. Let me get back on track for lunch. Truly successful people all get back on track in a short period of time. So it's not about being absolutely perfect. There are a few perfect people on the planet, but they are few and far between. And one thing I can tell you is that when you make a choice, the only thing that you can safely say is that there is another one immediately lurking around the corner. Don't get lost in the last one you made, but use the information, use the consequences of that choice as a way to provide and inform your next behavior. And I mean that very carefully. Before Socrates died, before he drank the Kool-Aid, he made a very interesting statement. He said, a life that is not examined is not worth living. It's kind of stark, but I take it to this. And that has a lot to do with what your goals and your choices are. If you came to me and said, you know what, I want to be fatter than ever. I want to be unable to take 3 steps without gasping for breath. And every choice you're making is leading to that outcome. Bless you, you've achieved your goal. But if you come to me and say, you know what, I want to be thinner, I want to be healthier, I want to be more fit, and all the choices you're making, or many of the choices you're making, are creating consequences that are not in line, not congruent with that outcome, it comes time to put the big boy pants on, because no one is going to do that for you. Now, one of the problems is we live in what I like to call a Judeo-Christian culture, meaning that we have this mentality of the good, the bad, the ugly, sin, this idea of the sinful mind, the sinful outcome. For about 25 years, I ran a place in South Florida many years ago, a health center. And because I was there that long, people would come 3 or 4 times a year. And, you know, we got to know each other. We became kind of like family. And it was always intriguing to me that when people would come in, many times they would wait 3 or 4 days before they would come and confess to me about that bad stuff they did at home. Now, you don't know me, but I'm about as far away from a priest or a rabbi as you're ever going to get in your natural life. And the truth of the matter is, when that person comes in and tells me that, on a fundamental level, that's not my chief concern. My chief concern is, what does it mean to you? What are the consequences of your actions, and what can you choose to do in your life that are more congruent in their consequences with what it is you are trying to achieve? And that's what we're really talking about in this summit. What are those pieces that you can put in that give you that tremendous opportunity to win, that opportunity to be successful? So it's not about sin, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's not about that bad food or that bad thing. In fact, the food is only a symptom Addiction is the disease. It's the problem. And you've got to solve that on a physical, metabolic, emotional, and spiritual level. And it's doable. It's fixable. No matter how many times you fall down, you get back up because it is fixable. But the bottom line is the consequence. So it's more about consequence, choice, consequence, and evolution rather than sin and negative outcome. And that also ties into this concept of forgiveness. And I want to just share something briefly with you. If you had a son or a daughter, or maybe your best friend, and you just bought a beautiful brand new vehicle, an amazing vehicle, $100,000 car. Now it's a rainy, slick night, and this person comes to your son, your daughter, your friend, and they say, look, my car is not working. Can I borrow your new vehicle? I got to go run an errand. And of course, with some hesitation, you may say, okay, do it, but be very careful. So they go out, and your son or your daughter or your friend comes back, and they totaled your car. Now, you may be all upset, you would be stressed, you may be raising your voice, you may be angry with them, but then at one point, you would probably stop because you care about this person, and you'd say, are you okay? What can I do to help? And what I'm urging you is to, with our own selves, with each of us, we need to come from that, what can I do to help question. I'm really shocked after all these years of counseling people, and it's about 45 years, where I have people that have diseases that take years to develop, whether that's cancer, arthritis changes, things of this nature. And it's unbelievable to me. It's remarkable to me how by making a few basic changes that we're typically recommended in how we eat and move, et cetera, how they can make a huge modification of that process. No more pain. They're healing this, they're healing. It's as if there is biological forgiveness built into the wisdom and intelligence of that body as it manifests its ability to heal and be well. And I'm urging you to identify with that forgiveness on a biological level, to lighten up and forgive yourself and to forgive others. That sense of self-forgiveness is so critical in terms of your own self-worth and your own well-being. And I say this because the lack of worth is such a huge piece in compulsive behavior and addiction. Addicts and people with compulsive behaviors have always been looked at as if they are bad people. They're not bad people. They have a problem. You wouldn't cast aspersions necessarily at a diabetic. The truth of the matter is the addict or the person with that kind of compulsive behavior and that brain distortion is coming from a place of dis-ease. It's a lack of ease. So you've got to build in that worth. And that's where things like counseling, group support, 12-step programs, what are they really about? Well, they're about making amends. They're about putting your faith and hope in something bigger than yourself for help and well-being. They're about helping others with the problem. So it breaks down the denial. It breaks down the self-centeredness. It reinforces your sense of self-worth. It reinforces your sense of self-esteem. It reinforces who you are as a divine being that has issues, that has things that you're trying to change with your goals. Now, tied into that, when we look at recovery and healing, the factors that we want to address, and I'm going to go through them, are number one, we need to eliminate all mood-altering substances. And there is really, if you could have controlled it, you would have. This really requires a little bit of an abstinence. And this is my new flag, because we're going to legalize marinara. Yeah, I think that's a good movement at this point for all of us. And then we come to plant nutrition, SOS free. This is kind of an intriguing piece because not only do the foods that we're talking about nurture us, not only do they incredibly eliminate or incredibly improve our opportunity to lose weight and body fat and reduce the risk of disease because they have low calorie density, high nutrients, high in fiber, water, all that beautiful stuff. But it also affects something that we call linkage. And this is about triggers. Many years ago, Thomas Saz, a psychiatrist in New York, and he wrote a book called Ceremonial Chemistry. We are very ritualistic animals. So if you think about when you're using certain behaviors or even foods, many times there's a setting to that. There's a location that's even associated with the use of these things. You get up in the morning, you have a cup of coffee. You get up in the morning, you have a cup of coffee and a cigarette. You get up in the morning, you have a cup of coffee and a cigarette. In a few days, the smell of coffee triggers all of your desire for cigarettes. In the brain, the body links those dots of connection. Now, why do I say that? Because when you look at salt and you look at oil and you look at sugar, they are major factors for linkage in the brain. They are major factors. Sugar itself has an effect on the brain very similar to cocaine. It's an exaggerated outcome of dopamine. And the bottom line is, the more you use it, you build a tolerance. If I take it away, you're going to go through withdrawal, all of that. And so why do you think the food processing industries have tried to sell you, or in selling you products that are fundamentally tasteless, all of this incredible chemical crap? There's only one way they can make that really palatable, and that's by adding things that are triggering the greatest sensitivity of taste in your mouth, which is basically salt and sugar. So the bottom line is, by adding these things and exaggerating the salt, oil, and sugar, you're reinforcing the inability to heal from addictive and compulsive behavior. And that's why we take it very seriously when we're trying to help people break these patterns of compulsive food use, to really go SOS free, no added salt, oil, and sugar. Now, we also know that when you're dealing with this, how many times in your own life have you started something, you're going great guns, and all of a sudden you're off track? All of a sudden you went back and you started, and relapse is a very big issue. But the acronym for relapse in the field of addiction is what's called HALT. And it is hungry, angry, lonely, and tired. When you're trying to stay consistently on a path to resolve addiction or compulsive behavior, you have to be aware of these particular issues. The hunger, because of the food we're recommending, all of that beautiful high fiber, high water-based, plant food, it's going to satisfy. The satiety of that is so high. If you're eating a lot of junk, think about it. It's got no nutrient value, no fiber. You walk around still craving and hungry most of the time, and the chance for relapse is significantly greater. Getting angry, stressed becomes an issue. It can drive that. We now know that under severe anger and stress, it only reinforces insulin resistance, making sugar more difficult to get into cells, driving our craving. Lonely. We know with fatigue, when you have people that are sleep deprived and fatigued, and we now know that there's such an increase in the transmitter of stress called cortisol. There's a remarkable increase in insulin resistance. There's a remarkable decrease in the hormone that gives us the signal that we're full, something called leptin. So when you're extremely tired and sleep deprived, you lose the ability to be satisfied. You lose, and so you're going to drive yourself, especially because of insulin resistance, you're going to start eating all of the refined sugar and all of that refined stuff that you can. So when we talk about relapse prevention, we want to eat in a way that's going to give us satiety. We want to understand the impact of stress. We want to understand the impact of fatigue and sleep in relationship to driving relapse. It'll give you a greater chance to stay solid and healthy on that track. You'll be in a much better place. And that relapse prevention acronym is very, very real. Now, I mentioned earlier in this talk that the neurotransmitters of brain reward that give us that sense of being happy and satisfied and having reward are built by amino acids. It has been discovered in the field of addiction that for people that truly have really heavy-duty compulsive behavior and addiction, that because the brain has gone through such distortion, while the food you're eating can provide these building blocks of amino acids, sometimes for a short period, they have to be taken in much higher dosages. So I'm not advocating that you run out and do this, but I'm giving you the program that L-glutamine, D-L-phenylalanine, L-tryptophan, and L-tyrosine are the cocktail of amino acids that for the past 30 years have been discovered to help people deal with craving and withdrawal while they're trying to do treatment. So if you find yourself having a very difficult time with getting on that track, it may very well be that the amino acid program may have value, and the cofactor for that is something called pyridoxal 5-phosphate, which is vitamin B6. So I'm only laying it out so that you understand that this is something that has been used in the field of addiction. Now, we in our field, we also do water-only fasting. Water-only fasting, in my experience, and I've used it with a number of really very sophisticated addictions, including Dilaudid, heroin, etc. We know that water-only fasting promotes detoxification. It can actually help significantly in the phase of withdrawal when that craving is so overwhelming. But what's another thing that's very powerful about fasting? It is really one of the most powerful introspective approaches, because when you're fasting, you spend a lot of time going internal, going inside. And we already made the point that understanding our own context, really, understanding, what these things mean to us. What does that food mean to us? Sometimes that introspective component of a water fast can be a very powerful tool for bringing that psychological and spiritual situation into focus. We want to increase physical activity. Physical activity increases natural opiates. In our brain reward pathway, there was a natural opiate in the brain called enkephalin. And enkephalin plays a major role in helping us release dopamine for reward and pleasure. When you have brain reward deficiency, we have a breakdown of that particular opiate, enkephalin, and physical activity will raise natural opiate levels. So it has a very unique and beneficial place in helping us really deal with these underlying factors, the biochemical part of addiction. We want to modify stress. When you're raising cortisol levels and you're increasing stress, you're increasing, again, changes in the brain that can drive weird behavior and imbalances of those neurotransmitters. So stress management in the form of meditation, yoga, qigong, breath work. Look, the most primal function that you have is breathing. I mean, what's the most important nutrient in the human body? Oxygen. You can go a long time without food. You can go a little bit without water. Can't go more than a few minutes without oxygen. So the way your breathing goes, so goes your emotions. By getting involved in slower, deeper breathing, breath work, you can bring the body into a place where the stress level can come way down. There's something called heart rate variability that operates, which is probably one of the best measures of chronic stress. It's difficult to measure, though there are now apps on phones that can actually do that. But we know that the heart beats a number of times a minute, and we call that heartbeat or heart rate. But there's also the space of time between those beats, and we call that heart rate variability. When that gets shorter and shorter, you're under much greater stress. We now know that when you slow your breathing down, you're activating a part of your nervous system called the parasympathetic nervous system, rather than the sympathetic nervous system of fight or flight, which is like that monkey mind that we all have all the time. And when you go into that slower, deeper breathing, you're getting that heart rate variability changing, and it's really reducing stress. It really will reduce that emotion. It will take things down. It will bring things into a little bit of a better balance. And you only need about 12 minutes of some activity like that kind of meditation a day. But in this recovery, in dealing with addiction and compulsive behavior, it becomes very, very powerful. We also know that there is two things that have been useful, and one is called cranial nerve augmentation. And this is actually treating reflex points in the ear with certain frequencies of stimulation in combination with a form of chiropractic care called torque release. One of the best ways that people can measure the effectiveness of any treatment in addiction care is what is called retention rate, meaning that when they enter a rehab program, how capable and how successful are they in staying in the program? Now, why is that important? Because when you go through withdrawal, when you enter, there's pain, it's discomforting. Most people check out. There can be as much as a 90% plus of people checking out before they finish the first 30 days. So one of the ways that they monitor and measure this is by looking at what can be done to keep people in programs so they can actually get the treatment done that they need. Well, they did a double-blind study at the University of Miami Med School with the Exodus Treatment Center many years ago, and they discovered that by working these simple ear points and by a form of chiropractic care that was done, they had almost 100% retention rate. Understand, normally it's a 97% dropout. So we know that these basic things that can be involved here in terms of some of these ancillary treatments. Now, that's something obviously you would need a therapist to do with you. It's not that it's necessary, but I'm laying it out that if there are recovery situations that have become difficult, these things are helpful. But the bottom line is understand the power of that SOS-free plant nutrition, understand the power of things like fasting and activity and simple stress management. These are things that are remarkably within your reach. And understand something too about nutrition. You know, there's been a lot of talk about, the gut flora and the microbiota that people have in their bodies. We have probably 10 trillion cells. We have 10 times that many organisms in the body. And we now know that those organisms require fiber in the plants that we eat to feed them. And when we feed them, they support the immune system. They produce chemicals that balance brain activity. And interestingly enough, there's a significant part of that gut flora that gives signals for satiety in compulsive overeating. So when you're eating refined food, you're not providing the fiber that those bacteria need. They're not going to give you the feedback again for knowing that you're satisfied. So we have chemicals for satisfaction. We have organisms for satisfaction. But all of these things are fed by the basic eating plan that we're recommending, that SOS-free plant-exclusive nutrition. So to go to the end here, this is my good friend William Burroughs, one of the great creative junkies of all time, who said, "What's love? It's the most powerful natural painkiller. What is?" Look, the bottom line here is when we talk about this particular area, we know the shortcomings that people have had. We know the trouble we've had sometimes with staying on track. We know the problems with the substances we're consuming, and especially many of them are mood altering, which creates its own dependency. And we see how our brains can be hijacked. But understand that this is a state of dis-ease, and it's a fixable problem, but it has to be addressed on all of those levels, biochemically, nutritionally, psychologically, to understand and break down that denial, spiritually, to get out of that self-centeredness, to look and be mindful of things outside of ourselves, but understanding fundamentally our own sense of self-worth, the beauty and the divine nature, the creature of beauty and awareness that we are, and aligning with that, setting in motion those choices that give us an opportunity to win and create that, if you will, that body weight and body fat we would love to have, that fitness that we would love to have, that health that we would love to have. And you have this opportunity by looking at the choices that we've talked about and the information you're going to gather through the other speakers and talks on this summit to really set that in motion. So I want to stop right there. And if AJ, you've got any questions that we can address related to any of this, I'll go there.
Thank you, Dr. Frank. This was a fabulous presentation, and I took 5 pages of notes, but one of the things that really stood out to me was the way that you explained withdrawal. I never thought about it that way, how it's that period of time for the body to adjust and start producing its own neurochemicals. I never thought about that.
That's why it's so painful. And that's why when people experience that phase, that's when they're ready to bail out of treatment. And not only that, that's where people, let's suppose you've got a compulsive food issue. That's where you're ready to go back to the sugar or go back to, because you just don't want to. But if you just hold your ground, and especially now, because we're providing foods with fruits and vegetables and all. And so the satiety that when you're eating in the way we're recommending really takes care of a lot of that. But you've got to understand more and more about what these foods mean to you too. What is the context of what it is you're trying to satisfy? What is the hunger you're trying to fill?
Yeah, but that's why it's so difficult for people to go through withdrawal. They can't withstand the agony of that. If they knew that in time it would get better, but I guess they're not feeling it at that moment that it's.
And that's where, if they're actually doing that, that's where that cocktail of amino acid supplements helps. That's where those things really help. So I lay that out so that at least people know that there's an option out there that they can kind of lean on if they're having so much difficulty.
Right. Or like you say, if they go to a place where you're doing a medically supervised water fast, that might provide a framework for them to be able to withstand this.
And look, if you've been up and down with the same food issues and the same weight issues over time, I really believe you're going to need some counseling. I really believe you're going to need some supportive program that takes you out of yourself, because it's obvious that you're not solving it on your own. And there are resources. People need to know that there are resources out there that can truly help them.
And support does really help, right?
Yes. It's major. And it helps a lot because it takes you out of that isolation and denial part. Remember, it's so much of addiction and pain is about your world gets so much smaller. It gets contracted because you get so self-centered. So that's why if you look at the 12 steps, not that everybody has to go to a 12-step program, but they're rather ingenious. The first few steps are about reaching out to something bigger than yourself. The second number of steps are about making amends with people that you may have wronged, and the third and the final step of all is helping someone with the same problem, really getting out of yourself. So they're actually kind of masterful. You don't need to have them, but the mentality of them on a personal level could still be something that you incorporate in your own path to getting well.
I thought that was really interesting when you were talking about D2 and how for some people, the first drink they've ever taken is the best they've ever felt in their life. So how do we know if we're that person so we don't take that first drink?
That's the problem. They can come with more genetic analysis, but the truth is, when you've got that modification of the D2 allele for that receptor, that's kind of just lurking. It's lurking there because it's there from birth. So now you take that first little substance abuse and boy, you're off to the races, baby.
And for some people, processed food can be like that too.
That's the bottom line is the point I was making. It's very clear with alcohol, but now we know that those altered metabolic pathways happen with all addiction, with food, with sex, with drugs. So yes, it happens with food too. And not only that, because of the altered metabolic pathways, you may not process that food the way someone else does. And it may lead to a set of chemicals that reinforce addiction, that reinforce compulsive behavior. And that's the reason why abstinence may be the best solution for those triggers.
Right. And I appreciate what you said, because one of the other experts, Dr. Goldhammer, says something similar, that if a person could have controlled it, they probably would have by now. But that for people that have really so much addiction, that moderation really isn't possible for them.
It's very difficult. If you can moderate it and you're going to do a little bit, look, I'm not the police. The fact of the matter is, that's why I made the distinction between use, abuse, and true addiction and true dependency. But the truth of the matter is, if you're finding that it's up and down all the time with the same food at the same, I'm guarantee you got a dependency and you got to address it that way. And abstinence may be the only way to go.
Right, but nobody likes that.
Nobody likes that word, the big A. Even in medicine now, you've got medically assisted treatment. So if you're coming off of heroin, they don't recommend abstinence. They recommend Suboxone. They recommend another opiate. So we're trying not to just replace one problem with another. But that's where things like fasting and things of that nature are so powerful, because they're very natural approaches that can make that a little bit easier for you.
Once heard someone say nothing tastes as good as abstinence feels.
Well, that's true. And the autonomy, the freedom of that, because anybody that knows that even if you can't moderate it and you don't want to let it go, you just know you don't feel good when you feel like you're controlled by all of that activity, when that brain is hijacked. There's something so incredible when you come into your own autonomy, when you really feel, no matter how many times you've been knocked down. And that's why I say, I don't really care. Pick yourself up, give it another shot, lean on the resources, and get back at it.
I like how you pointed out there's a difference between treatment programs and stabilization programs, because a lot of people get treatment, just like a lot of people go on diets and they lose weight, but they're not able to maintain the weight loss.
That's why treatment is a long-term process on an emotional, spiritual, psychological level. And stabilization just means getting basically through withdrawal and all of that, so that you're kind of like a little bit stable now to get on with the next phase.
I thought I heard you say once that for every year you're an addict, you need like a month of treatment did I get the math?
Yeah, they say that in the field of addiction. And I've had this argument because there's a lot of addicts that don't feel, they just feel that just locks them into being addicts. But the truth is, the original model was you need a month of treatment for every year of addiction. And when I say treatment, that means counseling. It means things like any kind of supportive situation like that.
Right. So, Dr. Sabatino, what's the real truth about weight loss?
Well, the real truth is that it is a constellation. It's not one single isolated thing. And because we're such complicated creatures, we're complicated because we're biological, we're psychological, we're spiritual, and we have needs. We have needs for sleep. We have needs for social interaction. We have needs for love. We have needs for food. So the real truth about weight loss is, how do you find some balance within that constellation of factors, and having the patience and the sense of self-worth and self-love to allow yourself the opportunity to really achieve those goals by setting the choices in motion that create the consequences for that success. And I think that's the real truth, is about how do we have the patience and self-love to really understand how important it is to get the most out of every breath we take. Once I went to a talk by a Buddhist monk, and he wrote in my book, I thought it was the best thing. He said, "May you live every moment of your life." That was his quote. And I urge people to understand that that's what this is about. It's about not what you achieve. It's not about the degrees you have, or the money you have, or the house you have, or the car you drive. It's how do you allow yourself to live every moment that you've got? And when we talk about health, and when we talk about eating the way we do, it eliminates all that other damage that now allows you to be the compassionate, empathic, healthy, dynamic human being that we were all put here to be. I believe that.
That's beautifully said. And it all starts with legalizing marinara.
That's it, right away.
That's great. Preferably SOS free. Thank you so much, Dr. Frank.
Thank you so much.